right, welcome everybody. And glad to be back here for another Politics and Tech update. We have a very special guest today, but let's start by introducing myself, Tim Watrous, Digital Advisors, and of course, Kevin Gordon, President of Capital Advisors. Kevin, great to be back here with you.
Great, good to be with you, Tim, and with you, Governor Weiss.
Yeah, and on that note, Governor Bob Wise, who obviously helped start Future Ready and was in Congress for quite a while, has a lot to share about what's been going on in D.C. So, Governor Wise, real pleasure to have you here. Thanks for joining us.
Great to be back, and especially to be sitting next, that is virtually next to Kevin, because I follow all of his reports on Capital Advisors.
Oh, nice. Well, glad you're keeping up with us here, and thanks again for joining. So, as usual, no shortage of news. There's a lot happening in the state capitol right now. And Kevin, would you mind just kind of fill us in on the Joint Assembly Senate plan coming together and kind of what that looks like?
Sure. I did want to say one extra thing, but I appreciate that comment, Governor, that Governor Weiss, for so many Californians that we deal with, I want to make sure people know the incredible work that he's done over his entire career, including during his tenure as governor, on education policy issues, but particularly with regard to really trying to get this innovation started from a technological standpoint in public education. And now we obviously have this crisis that one of the positive outgrowths of it, I guess you could say, is that it's created an imperative for us to do more on technology. And so all that work that you've done over the years, Governor, is now really starting to come to fruition in this major effort that everybody's doing to do something quality relative to distance learning. So I've always appreciated your accessibility when we go back to DC. You've joined our delegations when we pull together administrators to give them a background of what's going on the education front from your perspective. So I wanted to take just a minute to do that.
Well, thank you.
So thanks again.
As you point out, it's one thing to tee up the technology, but the policy has to be ready to move. And all of a sudden, things that everyone's been working on for 10 years are now, where it used to affect 10% of kids, it's now 100%. So the work that's getting done in Sacramento is going to show the rest of the country what needs to be done.
Exactly. Well, we appreciate you being with us, and I'm going to do a little overview about where we are in Sacramento, which I know you've been following, and then we're going to count on you to sort of fill in what we think might be going on back in Washington, D.C. on a few different dimensions of what we're working on that's so important. With regard to the budget situation, big news today. I mean, it started literally last Saturday when we got a look at what we thought the consensus was in the state assembly to actually move in the same direction as the state Senate to reject basically all the major cuts to public education, K-12 education in particular. And that is that we would not have a reduction to LCFF. We would not have the reduction that was queued up to the categorical programs. And in fact, we get a 2.31% COLA. That's just like almost unthinkable in this circumstance, but really great. When we took a look at the overall budget that the governor had at the May revision, and you looked at some of the narrative they were giving, there was this roughly 10% cut to the local control funding formula, but you saw that 10% number mirrored in other aspects of the budget. And one of the things that representatives of the administration pointed out is that they were trying to do an across-the-board sort of equity approach to the budget. And, you know, I'm not trying to be overly critical because this governor is definitely a friend of public education, but what we were saying is that a budget that does across-the-board cuts has no priorities, is that we need a budget that's got priorities and recognizes that in public education, it sets the stage for the return for economic growth and really a reopening that works. And until we get the education piece right, we're going to really have a problem in the state getting back to anywhere close to normal. So what the Senate and the Assembly recognize is that's the approach that we've got to take, is we flip the idea of triggers on its head, and instead of what the governor would sort of call triggering off cuts, you don't do the cuts at all. And in fact, if you need to invoke cuts, you would do them later. And what happens in his plan, and rather in the legislature's plan that anticipates federal support, is that if it doesn't materialize, the legislature's plan would then have the consequence be to K-12, not actual cuts, but in fact, just greater levels of deferrals. And, you know, many of you have seen, I know I'm a little reticent about just the magnitude of these deferrals, and we'll see what happens now that this is going to go to a negotiation period with the governor and the legislature on if they stay that high. But it did work through the Great Recession, and we had deferrals that amounted to the same amount of dollars, essentially $10 billion in deferrals that ultimately got paid back. The challenge here is that you got almost $10 billion that would be invoked if we don't get any federal support in a single year. So the outlook and the philosophy about no cuts is great. I think, the art of politics is compromise, and we'll see what kind of compromise the governor strikes with the legislature. But we're really hoping that he comes closer to where they are instead of the opposite. So we'll see what happens in the coming weeks. But we're really optimistic. Today was the only hearing that we expect to happen in the state legislature between now and the day they adopt the budget, which will be on time on June 15th. Nobody doubts that for a minute. So that means it's all going to be closed door, behind the scenes negotiation that'll happen. We will get a look at the details of what this budget looks like because we do have that 72-hour rule. So we'll probably see it on the Saturday that precedes the 15th. We're going to be in touch with our clients for sure on that weekend to let you know what we're hearing and what we're seeing as this stuff. And hopefully they'll come together and we'll have some announcements before we even get that far down the road. There's a lot of trailer bill language and components of this budget that's got to be written. The last thing I'll say is that even when the budget gets adopted, we are expecting change because they're not going to have an answer, we think, from the feds, and we're not going to even know until July 15th what our own revenue numbers are because we moved the tax deadline to July 15th from April 15th. So the whole fiscal picture is going to become a lot clearer after July 15th, which is a whole month later than when the legislature adopts its budget. It's a little backward to be sure, but we're hoping they're overestimating the size of the problem and not underestimating it. So I think I'll stop there, Tim, and then see what kind of information that Bob can help us with on the federal side.
Yeah, government-wise, I know we were talking about this a little bit in advance. This may be new to some folks, but you've seen things like this in the past, and maybe just share a little bit of your thoughts with that, particularly with the big deferral situation and some of the other things that Kevin's mentioning about the timing on this funding and the situation that the state's in right now.
Well, I think, Kevin, for both of us, and we've both been doing this for a while, this is an unprecedented time. The numbers are unprecedented as well as the situation. Let's remember the Great Recession of 2008 and 9, not a school was closed. We've got 50 million students, K-12, out of school, 3.2 million teachers. So this is, and as Kevin just pointed out, economic impact both in terms of loss of tax revenues, loss of revenues, and also if cuts have to be made, hundreds of thousands of school service personnel, teachers, and others that would be laid off. So this is an unprecedented time, unprecedented amounts. What I would bring to this is I don't think that there's going to be, I don't think there's immediate information coming from the federal government. The HEROES Act, which did pass the House, $3 trillion, roughly 70 to 80 billion for education, depending on how you calculate it. Everyone said that's not going anywhere. There's something in the paper today about 114 House Democrats wrote a letter saying they supported a $305 billion only for K-12 education alone. That's 3 or 4 times what was even in the HEROES. That's not going anywhere. Particularly significant because the chairman of the Education Committee and the subcommittee chairman of the Appropriations Committee, who has to write the check on that, both of them declined to sign it. So the reality is what we're looking at is something around probably sometime later in the summer, about $1 trillion or less than total stimulus package. And I say total, and that includes education, but it's likely to include more money for the Paycheck Protection Act, possibly an extension of unemployment, some other measures in there. So education, we still can't make any prediction. All education knows it's got so far is what was in the original stimulus bill, titled the CARES Act, which is $13.5 billion. And that's what I believe, Kevin, and what you're talking about, I think that's what's already been incorporated. And I believe you said the California Department of Education has already given guidance to the districts about how much they're going to get of that. So what's the bottom line here? Well, the bottom line is we don't know. And that's why it is increasingly important. And also, of course, in Washington, but across the country, as we're all gripped with the horror of the George Floyd killing, the reactions, what needs to be done, hearings being scheduled. Congress was on recess or on virtual working periods, as opposed to being in Washington because of the pandemic. Now it's focused on this. So it's going to be harder and harder, I think, for state legislators and for district officials to be able to get a handle. I'm struck by the California approach. Either way you go, it's sort of a Hobbesian choice. The thing about the California approach is it will put, assuming it goes through, Kevin, as you were describing, the triggers, the way you described the Senate Assembly package, that will put additional pressure on members of Congress, because if they do not act, then there will have to be cuts made later in the year, although perhaps with this deferral it doesn't take place for a while longer. But it does put more pressure on. I would just stress this, regardless of what comes out, it is critical that members of Congress understand what this is going to mean in education for the state of California, but for all states. I mean, right now, every state is going through a budget-cutting exercise that's ranging from 8% to 25% to start, and in education. And so it's critically important that members of Congress understand that it's not just about the dollars that's important, it's also about the timing. Because every one of the 14,000 school districts in this country have to have their budgets done by July 1, and most of them by law have to be making decisions about layoffs, closing schools, and so on, putting plenty of public notice out there, plus doing all the planning for what they're going to do in the fall, which is only 2 months away. So, a lot is still to happen. A lot of discussions going on behind the scenes. And one other thing I would like to mention, Tim, is that I was talking to a senior staff person today, one of the major committees, she was telling me that there's also likely to be an infrastructure bill. And this would go to, and Kevin and I were talking earlier, this could be part of a stimulus package on its own, in the sense of, one, money for crumbling schools and decaying schools, but also it could also help provide some of the broadband build out that needs to be done, and so that could take some pressure off the stimulus package. We get some broadband in the infrastructure bill. If we can get some school construction and renovation money, particularly given the needs around the pandemic, in an infrastructure bill, that puts more dollars in to be used more flexibly in a stimulus package.
I was going to mention something, Bob, that sort of given all of that, and our hope that there is a fifth stimulus package that Congress does pass, that the governor's plan and even the legislature's plan, even more so, have been what they would characterize as pretty modest in what they would anticipate getting. There's pretty good wisdom in that, right?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you all the major organizations, the teachers unions, the school administrators, and so on, put together a package proposed for $250 billion. Even the HEROES Act, which most people thought went pretty far, that was somewhere between 70 to 90. The best we've gotten so far is 13.5. And so you're right. I think the more modest approach is smart, and then that gives you room to build from there.
Right. So that's kind of where they're headed, is to try to be a little more careful, not count on everything being solved with this. And that's why sort of worst case scenario in the legislature's budget right now, as I mentioned earlier, is actually not cuts, it's more deferrals. And we do have to be careful with deferrals. And I know, you when you were in Congress dealt with sort of that tactic before, right? Talk about the mechanics of how that works.
Well, we didn't even have to deal with deferrals, because the nice thing about Congress is you don't have to balance the budget. But what I remember one year, what we did, I should say we, one of my early years there was a really tough budget year, and so they simply declared that the pay period for federal employees would be moved one day from September the 30th to October the 1st. That pushed it over into the next fiscal year, saved $3 billion that initial year, lowered the deficit by that year. course, you only put it on top of the next year. And so deferrals can carry you, and I wish I'd had deferrals when I was governor of West Virginia. Deferrals can carry you for a while, but eventually it sounds to me like there's a reckoning that takes place. The hope being, of course, that by that time the economy is beginning to rebound, and that the deferral, following up and actually paying for those deferrals isn't necessary. So I would myself, I'd probably be doing that action myself if I were in the California Assembly. But it's but we also have to be frank here. There are times when education by nature should be and is a state and local matter. But this pendulum has swung in that the federal government has to be a major partner in this, because it's not the education piece of it, particularly in a state like California that's an information-based state, is critically important. The economic piece, once again, hundreds of thousands of teachers, the economic impact of the education system, the whole CSU system, the whole UC system, the federal, and this is all across the country, the federal government has to be a major partner and a major fiscal partner during the next 2 to 3 years.
Yep. And so on the deferral piece here, it works just exactly the way you were talking, is that essentially they just push over, in this case, this month, we will make it'll only be 11 payments this year, and we'll push that 12th payment into the next fiscal year, which would be right after July 1st. Districts will get a payment. It's about $1.9 billion that the state saves by that maneuver, and they'll get their money, right into July, that first week or so, and then they'll pay their June bills with that. And then, of course, you keep going, and this budget, not only the legislature's version of the budget, but the governor's May revision counted on doing it one more time in the new fiscal year. And then at some point in the future, you do have to have 13 payments at some point in a fiscal year. This is a device that was used successfully by former Governor Jerry Brown, and it did work. So, but the timing was right, and the economics were good at the time when we tried to make it all well again. So all that has to fall into place if it's going to work.
But significantly, as you pointed out on the last update you did, is this amount of deferral will be almost, the 1 year of deferral will be almost what was the total deferral for the Great Recession. So once again, the stakes are even much greater, and that's why the federal government eventually has to come in. But this legislature is doing what every other legislature across the country is having to do right now. It has to act now so that schools can function and so that people have some idea of what they're working with going forward while it's waiting on the federal government. Right. They have no choice, so they're doing what they have to do.
And then what I wanted to mention to you, Tim, is that, so we talk about all this, the COLA, the holding the LCFF, so that it's not, going to have a cut and all of these different mechanics. The other thing to pay attention to is that all of the pots of federal dollars that Governor had in his May revision are fairly similar in the way they're utilized by the legislative approach. There are some subtle differences that are important, particularly one with regard to distributional kind of impacts relative to concentration grant versus sending it out, some of the money out through LCFF, and that looks like it's been largely sort of resolved, at least by the legislature. But that still is going to get hashed out. But the one part we haven't talked a lot about is the use of the majority of the federal dollars that will go. And that's where sort of you come in, and that is that there is going to be a heavy emphasis on making sure school districts are investing that into distance learning capacity, connectivity, the things that still really are shortcomings from us in districts all across the state. We got some issues there. They're going to have to get addressed because we know that we cannot do whole class instruction when we get into next year. We're going to have to do a hybrid. Some districts are already making the decision that they're actually not going to be opening in a regular schedule. They're going to continue with distance learning, at least at the beginning of the year.
Yeah, Kevin, interesting that you brought that up because we were talking to Andrea at SITE, Andrea Bennett, the executive director of SITE, about some legislation that they're backing back in D.C. The School Health and Library Broadband Coalition basically worked with Funds for Learning, which is one of the largest E-rate consultants in the U.S., and they came up with a number of $7.5 billion needed to address connectivity at home for not only rural but also urban scenarios where kids don't have internet access. That was as people have been negotiating back in DC, that's been dropped to $5 billion, and now most recently we're hearing maybe $2 billion. And on top of that, this week there was a letter that came to Funds for Learning asking them to remove the cybersecurity considerations in that funding request. And Funds for Learning position on this is you can't provide all these distance learning resources and connectivity without addressing cybersecurity, because one bad actor or one thing happens, you can actually bring down internet for everyone over wide areas of the folks that we paid to get the internet access to. So it's kind of an odd request. And as we've sort of mentioned in the past here, advocacy is needed at this time. You've heard it from Governor Wise and from Kevin that there are many possibilities of support, but the bottom line is we need something, and we need to act and advocate. So this particular legislation, SHLB, you can find some more information on the advocacy on the site page, also on their page. Please make a little bit of noise there. And then also make sure you're asking for the federal support we need to offset some of these cuts, because I think to your earlier point, Kevin, we're going to have to pay those deferrals at some point. And to steal the line from Jerry Shelton, your partner, he says, we'll gladly pay you Tuesday for a hamburger today. I mean, Tuesday's going to come, right? So we need that federal support to avoid that. And I think that's, just something to keep in mind. So I guess where my brain goes is I keep hearing about all these variations and all these potential solutions that might come from DC. And Governor Wise, you have far more experience in this than I do. Can you just fill me in a little bit on your thoughts on the timing, when we might see something actually come out? I know we got a couple minutes left here before we have to jump off.
So the timing to me, and Kevin works in this every day, the timing for me is going to be partly based upon the demand that people hear from their constituents. I can tell you what the process is, and the process suggests that nothing will be done. Discussions are taking place. There's a movement back and forth. There's some talk from the administration and from Senate Republicans about perhaps another package would be $1 trillion, but they want to wait and see how the first one plays out, and also what the needs are going to be on the Paycheck Protection Act. But the important thing that every educator needs to be doing, I would suggest, is saying to the elected representatives, we need help now. And so, and perhaps I've said that it's only going to be one stimulus package, and so we got to make sure it's loaded on. If they're going to be, you may stress, we need these needs now, and we'll have it, and then we're going to press you for a second one. But I want to come back to one central maxim I always have about advocacy, and that is, it's not the educator's job, it's not the parent's job to try to figure through the processes. Our job as an advocate to make sure that the representative understands the clear and pressing need. And so that's what I think is most important and needs to be done. I do hope that, Tim, in just the few minutes we have, can we talk about equitable services a little bit?
I don't know if we have enough time to get into it.
Well, then what I would say is the summary for every district leader is please make your voice known now. You're getting information from Sacramento, which they're giving you the best they can. Take that information and then show the representative what it really means in terms of your ability to deliver services in the next several months.
Great.
And Kevin, I want to say thank you very much, Governor Wise, for joining and sharing your wisdom. Kevin, any final words from you as we wrap this episode?
No, we'll be with you. Stay on the edge of your chair because there's a lot more coming.
It's a wild ride, and we really appreciate your wisdom guiding us through it. So thanks you both very much, and you both be safe, and we'll be talking soon.